there, Chef Nash from Trey Posty Catering and Events, and we are doing a vegetarian main course here for our 3-course holiday dinner. And so what I've chosen to do is kind of a riff off of a classic stuffed pork tenderloin, but instead of the pork tenderloin, we're using Delicata squash. So I'm going to jump right into it, but I want to talk to you about timing really quickly. If you're doing this meal, like the soup course is the first course, sit down and eat your main course, and then sit down and eat your dessert, meaning you're going to eat all the food in your kit at one time, at one meal. This one I would prepare at the same time, basically, as I'm preparing my soup. Basically, once I get my soup going, it's going to simmer for about 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, I would prepare my main course. It all goes into the oven, and it takes about 30 minutes in the oven. So basically, while you're pureeing the soup, enjoying your soup, drinking wine, having conversation, your main courses will be ready in about 30 minutes. So I'm going to hop into it right now. In your kit, you basically got the same thing that I got here in front of me. The only thing that you didn't get is a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of salt and pepper. So grab that right now. I'm guessing everybody has a little bit of oil. Doesn't even have to be olive oil. It can be avocado oil or canola oil. And if you don't have salt and pepper at your house, shame on you. So I'm going to start with my Swiss chard, braising down my Swiss chard. You got one of these little deli containers full of garlic and olive oil. So I'm going to watch my garlic really closely while this is happening. So I'm just getting my garlic started here right now. What I don't want to do is I don't want to cook the garlic, and I definitely don't want to brown the garlic. So just as soon as it starts to sizzle like that, I'm going to add my Swiss chard. So you got this big old bag of Swiss chard here. I'm going to go into the pan with the Swiss chard. That's going to slow my garlic down from cooking right there. So I'm just going to load up my pan because this stuff cooks down quite a bit. Got little napkins to soak up any of the liquid from your Swiss chard because we washed it and dried it for you, so we didn't want to give you soaking wet Swiss chard. So when I cook greens like this, I season it with salt. I season it with a little hit of black pepper, and then my garlic's at the bottom here. So I kind of want to try to move this around a little bit and get the chard to have contact with the pan, because my garlic is still cooking away underneath there. So I don't want to burn my garlic here. So if you don't feel comfortable doing that with your hand, grab a pair of tongs. I'm kind of like pushing it and moving it in there, trying to move my chard into the pan so my chard makes contact and my garlic doesn't right there. So remember, this is why I didn't brown my garlic to begin with, because the garlic that's in that pan is still down there kind of browning away. So I was going to try to find you one here. So my little garlic that's down there at the base of the pan is still kind of cooking away down there, and it's going to keep cooking away because this chard is going to take a little bit to wilt down. So the other thing I do when I'm cooking greens like this too is once it gets started and it gets rolling a little bit, what I do is I'll add just a little splash of water in there too. So I got a little sink over here next to me. I'm just going to add like a little splash of water in there. Kind of helps to steam the greens a little bit, and kind of helps to slow down the cooking process of the garlic so my garlic doesn't burn underneath there. So while my Swiss chard is cooking, I'm going to get a little red wine sauce started for you guys. So with the filet mignon for the other option here, we did a red wine sauce, so we're going to do a red wine sauce, but we're going to do a vegetarian style, kind of like a red wine glaze. So I've got a saucepan over here. I'm going to put that on high heat. What you got in your kit here is a little container of butter, 2 pieces of butter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one of those little pieces to that pan, get it melted down, and then I'm going to add the shallots to that pan. You got some chopped shallots in your kit there as well. I'm going to kind of saute those shallots down in there and add a little hit of salt in there because we're building flavors as we go. The salt's going to help the shallots to cook, and it's going to give a little base of flavor to my red wine glaze. So hopefully y'all have a little red wine at your house. Hopefully you're drinking red wine while you're doing this. You don't mind adding a little cup of red wine into the pan right now, because we're going to make a red wine glaze. So I added about 3/4 of a cup of red wine in there. And we're we're just gonna let that reduce down. I brought it up to a boil right there. I'm gonna season it with a little hit of salt. I'm gonna season it with a little hit of black pepper. We're gonna kind of let that go down. Remember, you've got that other piece of butter there. So make sure that this other piece of butter, you save it because we're gonna swirl it into that red wine sauce at the very end. In your kit, you also got one of these containers that's got potato gratin in it. So this potato gratin is gonna take about 30-35 minutes to heat up in the oven. Remember when we were doing the soup class, I told you to preheat your oven to 400 degrees. Hopefully you did that because your oven should be warm right now because we're gonna get this gratin in the oven. We're gonna get these squash in the oven at the same time. So I've got my Swiss chard here. It's kind of wilting down. It's wilting away here right now. I've got my heat on high. Still my heat on high. I'm just kind of wilting that chard down. So this chard is actually gonna cook inside the center of the squash too. So it doesn't have to be like fully all the way cooked right now in the pan. It can stay like a little bit on the al dente side. Just gonna roll over some of the other ingredients you got. So, full disclaimer, squash comes in all different sizes like people. Some are little, some are big, some are wide, some are small. So in your kit, you got like these big old Delicata squash that are like this big. I handpicked them for you because I wanted it to look like a pork loin roast, right? So it's like about this big, it's about this long, nice big old Delicata squash. I saved the two little ones for me, but that's cool because I'm gonna show you how to do this. It really doesn't make any difference. What we're gonna do is we're gonna end up stuffing these with our Swiss chard and dried fruit mixture, and we're gonna end up roasting these inside the oven. So over here I got that dried fruit mixture. I've got some figs, some apricots, and some cranberries. A lot of times what we would do is we would reconstitute these, but for this dish we really don't have to reconstitute them. Just as they are is fine. So, sorry, my little flame over here died, so I'm gonna trip up my camera person. I'm gonna switch that chard over there so it can keep cooking. My red wine sauce has got a little ways to go, but I'm gonna show you that in a second once I get this chard cooked down a little bit. So this is kind of a cool thing that you can do as a vegetarian substitute. It's got a lot of those like holiday table flavors going on to it. Dried figs, dried apricots, cranberries, cheese, Swiss chard, squash. For me, this is like great holiday flavors. So that chard is basically wilted down right now. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add that to the bowl with all my dried fruits while it's still warm. Remember I said earlier that a lot of times we would reconstitute those dried fruits. And I didn't do that here. And the reason I didn't do that here is because the Swiss chard has a lot of liquid in it. And so as it cooks and it roasts, all the liquid that's in that Swiss chard is gonna kind of reconstitute those dried fruits. So the other ingredient I'm gonna add in here right now is a little bit of Asiago cheese. And I add this in while it's still warm because I kind of want this to be like one homogeneous mass here to fill my Delicata squash with. So if we were in Sicily right now, they might add some pine nuts to this. This is like a classic side dish for Sicilian cuisine, Southern Italian cuisine, with the figs and apricots, and they would use currants there too. A little bit of hard cheese like Asiago or Pecorino in the Swiss chard. So I'm gonna grab a set of gloves here really quickly because I use gloves while I'm doing this. Keep my hands nice and clean, and we're gonna stuff this inside that Delicata squash. So I've got my gloves here. If you're doing this at home, you know, wait a minute or two until this squash kind of cools down so you're not burning your hands while you're doing it. But since I'm doing it here, I'm gonna glove up and I'm just gonna stuff away here right now. I'm gonna keep one eye on that red wine sauce that I got going over there because it's getting close but not quite, right? So what I do is I take that Delicata squash, I hollowed out the inside of it there and cut off either end. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my Swiss chard and dried fruit mixture and I'm gonna stuff it all inside that squash. Then we're gonna season the squash slightly with salt and pepper and olive oil, and we're gonna roast it in that 400-degree oven. You can see I'm really packing it in there. really want all the flavors in that squash. I'm packing it in and packing it in and packing it in. It's gonna continue to cook while it's in the oven, so it's gonna kind of cook down a little bit. So I'm really like making an effort to stuff it nice and tightly. So I got that one right there. I'm gonna do the other one too. So like I said, it's actually easier for you guys because you got those nice big old squash. It's like a big old tube, so it's easier for you to do this than it is me with my little baby Delicata squash here. But in the end, it's gonna cook all the same. It takes about 30 minutes in the oven. So once I've got all that stuff cooked, stuffed inside there, I put it on a baking tray here. You don't throw this away. You're gonna have extra of your squash, and I'm gonna show you what to do with that once all this stuff comes out of the oven. Just gonna take this and I'm gonna put a little drizzle of extra virgin olive oil on it. Little drizzle of extra virgin olive oil in it. Make sure we watch that red wine sauce. Once it gets down to this stage where it's reduced down by about 80%, I'm gonna turn it off and let it hang there for a second. So I'm gonna season the outside of this squash with a little bit of salt. I don't have to go crazy on the salt. I season the Swiss chard with the salt. It's got Asiago cheese in there too. So it's pretty well seasoned. So I'm just gonna kind of season the outside of the squash lightly. I'm gonna take this squash, I'm gonna take this potato gratin, and I'm gonna put them both inside the oven for about 30 to 35 minutes until the squash is nice and tender and the potato gratin is tender to a knife. So I've got one, thanks to the beauty of television, from my little imaginary oven down here that's been roasted until it's nice and tender. You can see my squash has stayed intact with all that stuffing that's on the inside of it as well. The reason I said to save this is because this is gonna go down on the plate as well. So I've got my potato gratin that came out of my imaginary oven. It should be nice and warm right now. What you can do is, to make sure it's warm, you can kind of take your tongs and lift up and separate those layers and kind of put your finger in there and make sure it's warm and hot to the touch right there. But after 35 minutes in a 400-degree oven, it should be nice and warm to the touch. I've got my Delicata squash here right now. It's been roasted until it's tender. Take like a sharp knife or a little steak knife, and a little paring knife, and do a little poke on it and make sure it's nice and tender. And then obviously the stuffing was warm when you put it inside there, so it's gonna maintain its heat as well. So I take this little bit of Swiss chard and dried fruits and I put that on my plate. This is why I told you to save this, because this is all your flavor right there too. I'm gonna take my squash, and I'm using a serrated knife while I do this so I can cut through all those greens really properly. And so I'm gonna make like a little Napoleon out of this. So you can see that squash is roasted nicely. It's got that stuffing on the inside too. So if you're doing this at home, or when you're doing this at home rather, you're gonna have that one long squash that you can kind of take and fan out across the plate like this. So it looks like that on the plate. And at the very end here, what I do is I take that red wine sauce that I was working on before. I had that last little knob of butter into that red wine sauce. Remember, we saved that little knob of butter. I just kind of mix it into that red wine sauce. So I've got the shallots, the red wine. What I'm doing here is I'm kind of bringing this dish together into a pairing with red wine, and I think the sauce really bridges together these ingredients. So that's why I'm doing this little pan red wine sauce here, a red wine glaze. So once I get that butter kind of mounted in there, I take that to the plate. I'm just gonna kind of glaze that Delicata squash that's been stuffed with the Swiss chard, those fall fruits like figs and apricots, and all those dried fruits like the cranberries. I'm gonna glaze it with that red wine sauce. So there you go, is your main course. This is a Delicata squash Napoleon. It's been stuffed with Swiss chard and dried fruits, and it's served with potato and celery root gratin. So, buon appetito.